evening, Damar. I think you're presenting today, right? Damari?
Good evening, sir.
Yes, you're presenting today, right?
Yes, sir.
Am I correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. So just wait on another person. We have two persons are here, so another person, and then I'm going to begin because we remember we have I think another week or so for summer school to end, and you have the tutorial paper to upload plus the research paper, and I want to kind of touch on the research paper as well so that I can give you some guidance. So today we're going to look at culture and business, looking at how culture shapes international trade, or shapes, well, not shape, but impacts or affects, whether directly or indirectly, an international business, or an international company that is operating in various locations. It could be that the company is a franchise, for example, KFC, all these fast food outlets that operate in Jamaica, and how the culture of Jamaica affects how the business operates, because of course they have to employ local citizens, and local citizens have to be part of management and stuff like that. All right, so we're going to look at that today. So let's wait until one more person comes and then we begin. Who else is presenting today? Oh, because there are only two persons. Alri is just on two devices. Alri, are you presenting today? I don't remember you presenting at all.
Yes, sir, I am presenting today.
Okay, good. Okay, all right. So we'll take the two presentations in the second half of the class, all right?
Okay, sir.
Okay, sir, all right.
All right, so let's go straight into it now that we have the other person in class. So good evening, everybody. I'm seeing Alred, Damari, and Jerome. I just want to point out one quick thing to you on Canvas. So let me share screen, share sound in the event that I do any sound. Let me go to Canvas first. All right, so on Canvas, you remember you go to modules and you will see the tutorial, the updated tutorial paper, and you'll also see sample research papers. All right, so that's important so that when you're writing your own paper, you can look at examples of how you're supposed to structure your paper. And we'll do some amount of consultation to ensure that the paper is properly structured. In the last class, I did mention, I kind of introduced you to how to structure an academic paper. Not everybody was here, and you notice there's inconsistency in terms of attendance. That's a problem. And I know people are, yes.
Question. The research paper, we even select like the one I want to do.
Did you read the coursework document? Have you read it?
I mean, just scan through. Somebody just ask a question like come in the class, you know.
I suggest you read it, but you will, what I suggest you do is that you guys pair up and do the paper only, so you can work by yourself or you can work with someone. But before you get to the research paper, I need the tutorial papers. Without the tutorial papers, you automatically fail the course. So you have to do the tutorial paper.
The tutorial, and I want to know what I do before.
Right, that is one that you did the presentation and you're supposed. This is why I tell you to read the tutorial paper, because the information is there. It's a much shorter paper, no more than 2 pages, excluding cover and reference page. All right, so it's about 5 paragraphs for the most part, or 6 paragraphs. All right, including introduction and conclusion. That is very, very critical. And as you ask the question, let me just go back to the assignments. So usually this is how it looks, right? So you have the tutorial paper, which is here, and then you have your research paper. All right, and in your case, there was, let me go back to the bin, because I don't think anyone has uploaded anything as yet. And because I had not shown you, even though I never had to, how to structure. So far, I've only got the in-class activity, but I must get the tutorial paper. I must get it. All right. I need to, right, the due date is August 20, right? Because that's the time. So I must get the tutorial paper by that time. So all the persons who have presented already, you must upload by Sunday. If you haven't uploaded by Sunday, I will be marking you, I will be awarding you a 0. All right, so please tell your classmates, all the persons who have presented already must upload your tutorial paper now, not the research paper, your tutorial paper by Sunday, 11:59. Going back to Canvas. So as I said before, sample research papers, and there are 2 papers that are there. If you plagiarize, I will know. So please do not go down that road, because you will be, you might fail the course if you do that, all right? So please don't plagiarize. Yeah, so the other thing now today I want to point out, as I said before, what are we going to focus on today? So today we're looking at the effects of culture and international business. So upon completion of this unit, students should be able to discuss the elements of culture that influences business activities within a country, discuss the elements within high context and low context culture. And sometimes you could also refer to it as high culture and low culture. Make contrast between high and low context culture within societies. Critically analyze how values in the workplace are influenced by culture using Hotseeds framework, develop a framework for cultural analysis. And you actually have a question on the final exam relating to this unit. All right, so just ensure that you understand, or you go about revising your notes. Can anybody say, in your estimation, how do you define culture? What is a definition that you would ascribe to the word culture?
Well, sir, that would have to be like some morals and standards a certain ethnic group or people live by.
All right, so you're talking about morals or standards that, and let's say a group of people live by.
Yeah, group of people, sir, yeah.
Yeah, a group of people live by. Yeah, that's a start. Anybody else wants to hazard a guess in terms of a definition of culture? Damari, how would you define culture?
Sir, sir, I would so how would I define culture? I would say that depends on how persons behave, their social behavior,
Mhm.
their ideas and their customs in that particular area.
Okay, all right. Yeah, so to some extent, you guys are both correct. So culture is so the general definition that people have is culture is a way of life of a group of people, right? That's one way of looking at culture. Another way of looking at culture is everything that is created by a group of people within a specific area that adds meaning to their lives. So everything that is created by a group of people, whether the creation is tangible or intangible, that have meaning to their lives or add meaning to their lives. All right, so that's another way of looking at the term culture. So in terms of some of the objectives, these are not necessarily all the objectives that we'll be looking at. So when companies source, produce, and or market products in foreign countries, they encounter fascinating and often challenging cultural environments. It's not always, so as it says, fascinating cultural environments and sometimes challenging cultural environments. So this, our discussion really explores the basic concept of culture and its effects on international business operations and to some extent business strategy. It explores cultural awareness as well as causes of cultural differences, rigidities, and changes. So in doing so, it focuses on the impact of cultural traditions on businesses and business activities, as well as the mutually satisfactory reconciliation of cultural differences. So one thing, for example, Jamaicans are known to be Jamaicans are culturally late for a meeting. So if you tell a Jamaican the meeting is at 2 o'clock, sometimes they will show up at 3, if not 2:30. All right, so a company that wants to invest or set up a business in Jamaica might need to take that into consideration, that they might need to tell the worker in their minds, they really start at 9 o'clock or 9 a.m., but they tell their workers to arrive at work at 8 p.m., knowing that they're going to be late. They're going to probably reach at 8:30. So in order to not penalize them, they tell them 8 o'clock, 8 a.m., but they know that really work starts at 9. Because somebody might say, oh, Jamaicans are hardworking, but them always late for work. And I'm not saying that that is true. It's just a sentiment that is expressed often or said about us as Jamaicans. So we looked at culture. So culture represents the specific learned norms of a society, attitudes, values, and beliefs. And this is a very, this is not a fulsome definition of culture, because what it really does, this is really defining intangible culture. I'm not sure if you have ever heard the term intangible culture. So intangible culture is anything of any aspect of a culture that is not tangible, meaning that you can't physically hold it, feel it, see it, taste it, or smell it. So you can't see attitudes, you can't see norms, you can't see beliefs, you can't see values. But there's also the other part of culture, which is the physical things that are created by a group of people, or the tangible things that are created by a group of people that add meaning to their lives, or even reflect their history and their heritage. So for example, Jamaicans, what are some of the things that we have created that is culturally unique to Jamaica?
The music and the type of food. I don't know.
So the type of food is tangible, but music is not. Well, we usually don't put music on the tangible, do we? I can't remember, but probably we can put it on the tangible. So the music, so dancehall is specific or unique to Jamaica. Reggae is specific or unique to Jamaica. So culture, for example, reflects norms and values and attitudes, right? And any company that is coming into a country would have to take that into consideration, the kinds of belief systems that exist in a particular country. So, for example, in the Middle East, women are not necessarily considered, are not quote unquote allowed. For example, a country like Afghanistan, where they can't remember the name of the group that now controls the country. They don't believe in female equity and equality. So in a country like that, if you're going to go there and establish a business, you have to take that into consideration. a country such as China, they, for example, sometimes have unethical business practices where children participate in the labor force or participate in the informal economy. All right, so you have children who are actually working when they should be in school. In a country such as Japan, they believe in working, working, and working to the point where there's a term that they use for it where people are work themselves to actual death. Because so there's a culture of hard work in that particular country. All right, so these are some of the things that if you're going to set up a business in a country, you would have to take into consideration. There are times when sometimes the values and attitudes or beliefs of the company do not reflect the values and attitudes and beliefs of a country. And sometimes there's a collision of the two. And we'll get into some specific examples relating to that. So cultures consist of people who share attitudes, values. I kind of said this already. And yes, culture is dynamic, which means that culture evolves over time. So Jamaicans, I think have, what are some of the things that Jamaicans were against, but now they've kind of come around to, it's okay, or we're not paying attention to it, or them can do them thing, or we kind of come full circle relating to that, or half circle, not necessarily full circle. I'm listening, guys. Can you guys think of any example of something that culturally we found offensive and we were like, no, or we were not afraid to it, we didn't like it, but no, we kind of said, we're not really business, I'm for them business, that kind of thing. Can you think of any example?
So I think that never.
Go ahead, Demari. Why? Don't be afraid to talk. This is a safe space.
So, all right. So in the Jamaican, where based on, all right, what person's doing their bedroom, then persons used to, Jamaican used to say no, but no, it's not being really bashed on again, like back in the day, I would say.
Okay, so you're euphemizing. He's trying to politely say. So we have the terms cunnilingus and fellatio. So whether a man performs oral sex on a woman or a woman performs oral sex on a male, it's not as taboo as it used to be before. Even though you have people who are openly having those kinds of discussions. So there seems to be some kind of evolution in the culture or in the attitudes towards those kinds of things. Even in relation to the whole notion of LGBT or, let's say male homosexuality, because, female homosexuality is not really the issue. While the society remains homophobic to some extent, I think the country itself, has kind of come full circle, well, not full circle, but half circle in terms of openly being like wanting to physically harm people, because now you're seeing people who we suspect to be male homosexuals in government, they're in different sectors. Some of them are influencers. So there seems to be a kind of full circle, well, not full circle, half circle in terms of the general attitudes towards that. Even in the workplace now, there are some workplaces, for example, Digicel, if you're homophobic and they know and you make homophobic remarks, you might be fired. They're very, very, they are very stern as it relates to the attitudes and how you treat people in the workspace. And I know even some of the corporate companies like NCB and Scotiabank, when it comes on to people's orientation and matters like that, they make sure to try to foster a culture of diversity and inclusion. Many times they're not saying this publicly and saying it in front of everybody, but there's a kind of unspoken agreement or understanding, let me put it that way, understanding relating to that, the matter relating to people's private lives, even in terms of how Jamaicans originally were expressed their political views and, like bombing people's houses because of their association to different political parties. You find that that is no longer the case. We have kind of come full circle on that. Well, not full circle, but to some extent, well, let's say 3/4 of the way in terms of political views, even in terms of, there's another example I was thinking about, like the inform of a dead culture. There seems to be an evolution on that. We're not so much, because the crime rate is out of control. So people are no longer embracing this inform of a dead kind of behavior. We see that women are now being championed. Well, people are now championing women to take leadership roles. So that the level of sexism that used to be there, to some extent is there, but it's not as there as before. So you find that there, and if anybody disagrees with me or wants to add a comment, but I think the country itself, in terms of some of the attitudes and values and beliefs, there seems to be some sort of evolution in relation to Jamaica. And of course, a company now that is coming there to establish, let's say, set up shop, they would, it would be important for them now to get a sense of what is happening in the society. And this is most times why they hire locals in very high positions, because when it comes on to management, they want somebody who understands the culture of management in Jamaica to deal with local staff, for example. Any comments or questions?
Sir, I definitely agree on that, with the evolution. And just think back on it, I see more females going in the engineering field as well. Persons used to say engineering or something relating to that is mostly for men, but females coming out in that field and working and do really well on that.
Yeah, and the reverse is true too, for the fact that more men, we find that males are now becoming nurses, because I've taught the nurses at Excelsior for a number of years, and I've seen the number of male nurses increase over time, because there's a kind of the kind of perception or gender perception attached to certain specific professions. There seems to have been an evolution in relation to that. A part of culture too is the notion of national identity. What makes us Jamaican? What makes us Canadian? What makes us American? There's this notion of a national identity and the kinds of symbols that are used to define and public and make visible displays of national identity. Over the weekend, for example, in Canada, I went to the Jerk Fest downtown. Was it downtown? Yes, it was in Etobicoke, and people had their flags. Persons who didn't have flags, not just Jamaican flags, but you had persons from other parts of the Caribbean. They had their flags, or they wore their country colors, and that was a way for them to identify, or for people to identify their nationality. In other instances too, you have some persons who don't just define themselves by nationality, but by ethnicity. So an ethnicity is a group now. So when we're talking about ethnicity now, we're talking about a group of people who identify themselves not only based on nationality, but also on culture. So even though some Chinese, quote unquote, are, well, not quote unquote, but some Chinese are born in Jamaica, they still identify as Chinese, and Chinese is a nationality, but to some extent they might see it as a kind of ethnicity or as a kind of cultural thing, because they're going to eat the food that is unique to Chinese, even though they are born Jamaicans. All right. Then you have what I want to call ways of how you can examine culture, whether culture is being diffused, meaning that it is being erased, or whether culture is being affected by other outside cultures. So you have something called cultural imperialism. Can anybody has ever heard the term cultural imperialism? Have you ever heard that term, cultural imperialism? Hello. Has anyone ever heard the term cultural imperialism? There is silence. Why no one is talking?
No, sir, I haven't heard it before.
Jerome, have you ever heard it? Alray, have you ever heard the term cultural imperialism?
No, sir.
No, sir.
Okay. So cultural imperialism, no, in the case of cultural imperialism, what they're saying is that there's a dominant culture that is imposing itself on local culture, or it is a kind of outside culture. So it says, for example, change brought about by the imposition is known as cultural imperialism. The introduction of certain elements of an outside culture. Well, they're kind of not defining, this slide is not the best. Some of the terms are being scattered all over the place because cultural imperialism and creolization is not the same thing as cultural diffusion. And if you talk about cultural diffusion, you have to talk about cultural erasure. So they're kind of using the terms all over the place. So creolization now is really where different culture, like say for two cultures or two cultural, two cultures come together and they're mixed. So it is mixed in a way that gives rise to a different or to a new culture. So in Jamaica, for example, a lot of our cultural expressions are very creolized because we have carnival every year, right? We have carnival every year.
Oh yeah.
And carnival is, yes, and carnival is not something that is uniquely Jamaican. It didn't come from Jamaica. It was brought to Jamaica. So that's not something that is unique to Jamaica. It was brought to Jamaica. And then we now have carnival or soca it has become a part of Jamaican culture. If you notice, you notice that we don't really have soca artists in Jamaica? Because it's not really a Jamaican, it's a part of our culture, but it's not our culture. It is something that was brought to Jamaica. So would be an example of creolization where there's a mixing of two cultures to give rise to something new. So that will be an example. Some of the foods that we eat would also, so many of us will love Chinese food. I'm sure, I don't know how many people here, we go to the Chinese restaurants and we buy their food. But the Chinese restaurants, they're actually cooking Jamaican food, but they're cooking it in a way that reflects both Jamaican culture and Chinese culture. So that would be another example of creolization, the kind of mixing of two different cultures within a particular space to give rise to a different sort of culture. I'll get into the other two terms, but they're kind of all over the place. They don't structure the thing properly. They're kind of using the terms all over the place. They need to be properly structured and spoken about within a particular context. Language as a cultural stabilizer. So language again becomes a part of one's national identity based on the language that you speak. And I would go beyond just language because many countries speak English. So many countries use the English language. However, the individual countries have their own version of English that they speak, which some refer to as dialect. So in Jamaica, we have English language as our official language, but along that English language exists along a continuum. So we have English, we have Jamaican Standard English, then we have mixed Jamaican English, and then we have Creole, or we want to call it Patois. So the language now becomes a part of a way for people to know who you are and where you are from. You speak the language. And this is why in many movies you hear when they want to signal that this is Jamaica or the person is Jamaican or they're mimicking Jamaican, them say Wagwan. Because the phrase, the utterance of that is something that is uniquely Jamaican and can used to be an identifier as Jamaican. I'm not getting into some of these things are not as religion. No, is another, and they're kind of talking about agents. Some of these are really agents of socialization. So, for example, religion would be an agent of socialization. So we know that religion plays a fundamental role in countries. So religion can be a strong shape of values and beliefs and is the major source of both cultural imperatives and taboos. So in Jamaica, for example, the whole notion of homophobia is actually rooted, you know, many when you listen to some of the songs they talk about is, I think they quote Leviticus 13 verse 7 or something like that. It's some Leviticus thing they're quoting, that if a man lies with another man, he should be put to death. And it is on that basis now that Jamaica becomes this very homophobic country, or is considered this very homophobic country, because Jamaica considers itself very religious. And we are going to hold fast to the view that we're religious. Even though we kill people every day, 10 or 5 people every day, we're very religious. And we have probably the most churches per square mile, but we're killing people every day. And we believe in God. And sometimes even when some of these criminals are killed, they have a Bible in their back pockets. It's a kind of very paradoxical kind of thing. You also have to understand religion within the context of how it might inform a labor force or the labor force or staff. So in Canada, how religion, so Canada doesn't have an official religion, but it allows people to practice their own religion. So Canada is described as multicultural. So when I used to work at a company as a marketing manager, some of my colleagues were Muslims, and at different points during the course of the day or the week, they would go and pray, and they have their mat and they use that to pray, and it becomes a kind of sacred. I think the term is, it's a kind of religious, let me call it royalty, the mat, and and their practicing of their faith. Very, very important. When you have Ramadan, they have to leave work. Sometimes they would not come to work. That's when they would take their leave. There are certain things that they don't do in the workplace because of their religion. This example, when one of my colleagues, she and I, we talked very, very well, and she didn't come to work for a period of time because she wasn't feeling well. And I remember when she returned to work, Jamaicans were very touchy-feely, so I went to hug her, and the look on her face in midway hug, I had to lower my hands, because in their religion, I might be wrong, but my understanding is that you don't hug a married woman. A married woman is not to be touched or hugged. Not necessarily touched, but not hugged, because that is seen as some sort of affection. And all of these things now would affect and inform some of the business practices. All right. So, and then remember too that if you have an international company going to set up shop in different, functioning as a multinational corporation, every country has a different religion. If you go to the Middle East, they're different from if you go to continental Africa. If you go to North America or Latin America or Central America, different religions, and as a result, that can affect businesses. And as it says too, that some religious groups are very violent, and they will see an international company as the enemy. For example, they might say the international company is not a genuine company, but it's really a kind of front for, let us say, the American government or the Chinese government or some sort of terrorist group. So you might find that locals are very hostile towards an international business. I'm not getting into all of that. They're showing religions all over the world. I'm not really getting into that. So behavioral practices now affecting business, social stratification systems, and this is talking really about class systems. So, in Jamaica, we have the lower class, the middle class, upper class, and in many countries you have that. And you have the lower class, you have the lower middle class, and you have the lower upper class, and then you have the middle class, and you have the middle lower class, and you have the middle class, and you have the middle upper class, and you have the upper class, then you have the upper lower class, and you have the upper middle class, and then you have the upper class. So there's a rigid, well, not really rigid, but there's a class system in Jamaica. In countries such as India now, you have a caste system where, depending on where you are born, depending on which group or family you're born in, it determines where you are positioned in the society, and you cannot, to some extent, get out of that. And you find that even sometimes that's how people leave countries such as India. When it comes on to motivation, you're looking at, for example, what drives people's attitudes towards work. Are they motivated to work, willing to learn new things? Is it a culture? Is it a space or place where they are very responsive to new technology and things like that? Relationship preferences. There are some countries that they want to have a certain type of relationship with the government, or don't have a certain type of relationship with the government. They might want to have certain kind of business practices. They're, in terms of risk-taking behavior, they might be running a sweatshop, and they might have unethical practices. Some businesses, for example, do want to set up shop in countries where people can unionize, and this is partly why some of the American companies are not operating in America, because Americans are of the belief that to some extent they must be unionized. You have to provide certain basic healthcare and certain benefits. And some of the companies are like, no, I'm not doing that. Why should I do that when I can go to Jamaica and pay them pittance? So those kinds of things affect business. When it comes on to, I was speaking to this about ascribed and acquired group status. So ascribed is where, you know, depending on where you're born, that's where your position in the society. And acquired is based on the fact that you might be born in the lower class, but you use education as a way to move along the social hierarchy, whether it be from lower class to middle class to upper class, you know. So you might have somebody who was born in Tivoli Gardens becoming a medical doctor, and getting certain benefits, for example, and living a certain quality of life. All right, I'm not going to get into the social stratification. I think some of that discussion is not as essential to our discussion as we're having. So some nations base a person's eligibility for job and promotions primarily on competence, but in others, competence is of secondary importance. So you find that sometimes Jamaicans are like that. So Jamaicans have this obsession with being very conservative in the workplace, and even religious. So if you have a tattoo, they don't want to employ you. If you have locks, they don't want to employ you. Sometimes you can't even go to school. If you wear earring as a male, they might have a challenge with that. So you find that those kinds of things can affect a business deciding where to set up shop. And then thinking too that the country is not as free as it should be. For example, the moment I came to Canada to live, I just pierced my ears, because when I was in Jamaica, Excelsior would scoff at me if I pierced my ears, and though, why would you pierce your ears? You're a role model. And I would be like, I don't want to be anybody's goddamn role model. You're paying me to teach, so I'm teaching. I don't want to be anybody's role model. But in certain professions, you are seen a role model, and sometimes it's a burden because you can't get to live your life as freely as you'd want. I remember one time I was at a bar and I teach adults, and a student came in and saw me smoking, and they were like, "Sorry, you did," and I'm like, "What the? I'm a grown-ass man. I should be able to live my life, you know." So those kinds of things. So you find that Jamaica is a very quote-unquote conservative and pretends to be religious society. You have a lot of hypocrisies, and sometimes it's the eligibility for persons is not necessarily based on competence, but sometimes it's just based on other things. Look, in Canada now it's a different thing. You have police officers who have tattoos, for example, and you have people go to work. In Jamaica, for example, I don't necessarily have to wear tie and dress up and all of that, you know, looking so like I'm going to church for a hot country. In Canada, you can wear a nice business casual. I do business casual and go to work, and you're good. You can wear a dressing sneakers, for example, or dressing trainers. You don't necessarily have to wear shoes as in Jamaica. You don't have to look so formal. And I'm talking about even in Canada, for example, people don't get caught up. In Jamaica, everybody has to be Mr. Clark or Mr. Brown or Mr. This and Miss This. In Canada, everybody call me by my first name. I don't want you to call me anything other than my first name. It's a different kind of country. In Jamaica, now we get caught up in titles. In Canada, it's like, no, you don't get caught up in titles. I remember when I got my first job here, and I called my boss, Mr. I call him Mr. Something. And it's like, no, Robin, just call me, my name is Ahmad, just call me Ahmad. That's good enough. Because here is a little bit different. They don't get caught up in titles. So you have gender-based groups. There are strong country-specific differences in attitudes towards males and females, as well as vast differences in terms of regarded as male and females. And we spoke a little bit about that in terms of some of the roles that women are expected to perform and some of the roles that men are expected to perform. If you look, for example, in a lot of the multinational corporations or the fast food outlets in Jamaica, who are cashiers, the cashiers are predominantly female, and the servers are to some extent sometimes male, but female, and the men sometimes work at the back. They're the ones doing the hard labor. So it's as if they have these kind of very gender specific roles in those particular kind of countries. And it could be that the business, for example, it could be that KFC does that or Burger King does that because of how the society itself deals with the issue of gender relating to men and women and the kinds of behaviors and expectations of both men and women in the workplace. Age-based groups, we know that in some countries, there is a certain cutoff point in terms of when you're supposed to retire. And in other countries, sometimes that's not the case. I know, for example, in Jamaica, I think the retirement age is 65. I don't remember if they have increased that. 65, somewhere thereabout. In Canada, you don't even put your age on the paper. You're not supposed to put your age on your resume. You don't put your age and you don't put your address on your resume. It's considered discriminatory. You put your area code, but you don't put your actual age on it because they see it as a form of discrimination. And sometimes they don't want you to. Another thing too is that identity plays an important role for some international businesses, like they operate in Canada. So in my current job now, I got a new job. I'm a supervisor at a college here in Canada. And my job before that, when I worked at the university, when you're setting up, for example, certain things, you have to tell them if you identify as he or him. Even if you're physically male, you have to tell them how you identify, whether it's he or him, because you do have male who go, they have the transgender kind of thing. And you have female who are also transgendered and they have a different thing. And even the notion of recognizing indigenous people and indigenous land, those things are very, very critical. So when people are going into societies where it's very multicultural, you have racialized groups or groups that are considered discriminatory. In some countries, they literally have a quota system where racialized groups or minority groups must be represented as a part of your workforce. And that is something that an international company would have to take into consideration as part of that. You have countries too where family life is important. Some countries, in China, for example, it's kind of a one child country where they don't allow people to have more than one child. In other countries, that's not necessarily the case, and this again will affect, for example, maternity leave in a country too where you might have paternity leave, and how that might impact an international business that operates in Jamaica. How the company deals, for example, with the issue of maternity leave, paternity leave, and all of that, and whether or not they have to pay them when they're off. And this is why some of the companies know what they've done. They have gone, especially in some of the international companies, they have gone by way of contract workers. And some persons are paid an hourly rate. And if you're not at work, you don't get paid. So those things are also a part of the mix. And that is something that, you'd have to look in terms of culturally, does the country value family? Culturally, how do they define family and see family in the society? Because that again will affect the kinds of staff or the kinds of things that are happening in your company as it relates to family. Because people say, but you don't think I could just get married, I need time off and things like that. I won't discuss this one. I think think this one is a kind of self-mode. Some of these things I'm not going to get into all of the this one, no, you find that how I would discuss this, let me just see if my phone wants to, not my phone, my laptop wants to charge, because I haven't plugged it in since I've been teaching you, and I don't want the battery to, because it has a tendency to just turn off. Why can't I see the thing up here? It's at 54. Give me one sec, guys. Let me just plug in my charger. My laptop charger. For this one, you have materialism and leisure. So I would describe Jamaica as a very materialistic country. I don't know if you guys would agree with that. I think Jamaica is very materialistic. We see it a lot of what I would call a lot of public display of materialism. You know, people go to, for example, parties and they are drinking NSC and they're drinking all these very expensive things, and they have to show, they have to record it. You have people would walk into the camera and kind of touch their clothes for you to see it is a Tommy Hilfiger, or they're wearing a Jordan, the latest Jordan shoes. So we tend to be very materialistic, and that's a part of the culture of the country. And I don't know if you guys, what do you guys think? Kemar, Jerome, Damari, Alray, what are your thoughts in terms of Jamaica and being materialistic?
Sir, them have a saying, say, anywhere Jamaicans going in the world, you will always know, because them have to actually demonstrate that, you know. They have to show, once you see a Jamaican, you're not even have to hear him talk, but they are firing a blast this reggae music, and you know, you can definitely know say it's a Jamaican. The way them dress, you know, the way them showcase what them have on, and so on. Them put it not everything what them do.
And I think it's something that is unique to Black people too. I think as Blacks, we tend to, you see it even in North America, Black people, there's this it's like we have to have this public display of success, because we don't feel, I don't think we feel assured and actualized. So we have to, you know, wear the biggest chain and bring this sort of attention. How this is important to international, to international business and culture, is that a business would want to understand that, because in some countries they don't desire material things, they desire leisure over achievement, in the sense that they're not going to work very long hours. They're not going to kill themselves and work very long hours, because leisure is important to them. Family is important to them, versus other countries where you might find that the country is very materialistic. So if you're giving people a certain amount of salary, they're willing to work. All right. So a company again would want to understand that if they're going to set up shop. I'm not reading all of these. Masculinity. Let me just look at this. I don't want to get into a very gendered discussion about, no, let me not. Relationship preferences. Okay, this part is important to some extent. In some cultures, there's a collective sentiment in terms of people work together and are willing to work together. In other spaces, sometimes there is people tend to be very individualistic and, to some extent, selfish. I would want to add, and that again can affect, as it says, management style, marketing behavior. It can affect workplace culture, organizational culture, politics and stuff like that. When I say politics, I don't mean politics as in PNP and JLP, but the kinds of politics in the workspace. in terms of the kinds of discussions and so forth. I don't want to get into all of these things. Some of these things are not necessarily. Some of these things are not on the syllabus. This is why I'm kind of skipping over. All right, so this part is important about low context culture and high context culture. And as I said before, I think this is on the exam as well. Culture is on your final exam. So language represents a culture's means of communication. In a low context culture, people rely on first-hand information that bears directly on a decision or situation. People say what they mean and mean what they say. Can you think of a country that would be considered a low context culture? Where people rely on first-hand information that bears, or people say what they mean and mean what they say.
Jamaica, sir.
I don't know that Jamaica would be considered low context. People say what they mean and mean what they say. No, so Jamaica big hypocrite. I don't know that they mean what they say and say what they mean, because they're telling you 2 o'clock. Oh yes, the meeting's going to start at 2, and when you're there at 12, 4 o'clock before the meeting starts.
Oh,
I don't know that.
That's true.
Yeah, I don't know that we fit into that category. I think we're just hypocrites. We're big hypocrites in my mind, in my estimation. In a high context culture, people always rely on peripheral information and infer meaning from things communicated indirectly, and they give it the example of Saudi Arabia. I think another country that is low context culture would be America. Americans tend to mean what they say and say what they mean. So they're very, let's use racism as an example. They are very, what I like about their racism is that they don't hide it. I prefer that. If you don't like me because of my skin color, I prefer to know. In Canada now, they're very polite. We have polite racism in Canada. It's very, very polite. Very, very, very polite. I recently, from my previous job, my new supervisor, I knew she was racist. I knew she couldn't stand up bone in me. She pretended, she had to be professional, but because my bosses before were white, and I never, experienced any level of racism with them. And she had this she was very subtle, but I wasn't, I could pick it up. Yeah, this can be monochronic culture and polychronic cultures. So all cultures categorize, plan and quantify, but the ordering and the classification systems they use often vary. So in monochronic cultures, for example, North Europeans, people prefer to work sequentially, but in polychronic cultures, people are more comfortable working on multiple tasks at the same time. And I think Jamaica would be an example of polychronic, because we are always working on doing a million things. We're on the phone, we're doing this, we're doing that. Likewise, in some cultures, people focus first on the whole, then on the part. Similarly, in idealistic cultures, people will determine principles before they attempt to resolve issues. So these are some of the things also that an international business would have to take into consideration. And they're showing you some examples of monochronic and polychronic cultures. Our strategies for dealing with cultural differences. But before I do that, there is something else that I want to, another part of the discussion relating to culture that I want to touch on, and it's actually in another lecture. So because I also have to watch the time for the presentations. Where is it? So let me not forget this, because this is important as well. Is it this one? No. It's this one. So some of the information you might have heard before, but I must touch on these things, all right? We did talk about culture, but let's listen.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Business School 101. In the story called The Blind Men and the Elephant, 6 blind men encounter an elephant for the first time. Each of them touches a different part of the animal, and their variety of perspectives leads to different assumptions of what an elephant is. This story depicts how reality can be perceived in many ways, and that there is almost always more than just one ultimate truth. Like this metaphor, culture is a concept which is not easy to define. So, what exactly is culture? How is it formed? What elements are included in the culture? In this video, I'm going to answer these questions for you. Based on the definition, culture is a set of values, beliefs, rules, and institutions held by a specific group of people. Most of the time, culture is like an iceberg. What is visible above the surface is only a small part of the culture. Below the surface are a massive base of assumptions, attitudes, and values that strongly influence people's decision-making, relationships, and other actions. Culture influences every aspect of our daily lives, which includes the food we eat, clothes we wear, the language we speak, and the music we listen to. Culture is formed in a very complex way and influenced by various factors. Here are 3 geographical factors which could affect culture. First, landforms. Landforms include physical features like mountains or oceans. If you live in the mountains, you're likely to develop a particular culture that adapts to life at a high altitude. For example, you might wear heavier clothing and tend to be physically stronger as a result of climbing often. On the other hand, living near an ocean might mean you wear lighter clothing and incorporate swimming and fishing into your culture to a greater extent. Second, climate. Climate can also greatly affect culture. Compare the Inuit people of Alaska with the desert-dwelling nomads of North Africa. These 2 cultures are extremely different in many ways, and most of those ways can probably be traced back to the differences in climate. Hot weather drives one group to travel routinely in search of water and other necessities, while cold weather prevents the other group from traveling for much of the year. Third, natural resources. Natural resources impacts what type of culture develops in terms of lifestyle and economy. Are farmlands available and productive? If so, plant-based diets might be very popular and an agricultural economy might thrive. If not, other foods may become dominant while other types of economies take hold. To most people, culture is a very abstract concept. Actually, culture includes a broad range of different elements such as values, attitudes, manners, customs, languages, religions, social structures, etc. So, let us discuss these elements separately. First, values and attitudes. Values refer to ideas, beliefs, and customs to which people are emotionally attached. Similarly, attitudes refer to positive or negative evaluations, feelings, and tendencies that individuals harbor towards objects or concepts. Values and attitudes are learned from role models, including parents, teachers, and political or religious leaders. Once those values and attitudes are established, it is very difficult to change. People from different countries might hold significantly different values and attitudes toward the same behavior or event. For example, whereas people in Singapore and the US value hard work and material success, people in Greece and Brazil value leisure and a modest lifestyle. Another example is that different cultures could have dramatically different understandings towards punctuality. For instance, being just 1 minute behind in Japan is considered being late, whereas meeting on Moroccan time can mean anything from being an hour up to an entire day late for a promised get-together. Second, manners and customs. Manners and customs are also important components of culture. Manners are rules that govern social behavior, promoting goodwill and cooperation. Customs are actions, behaviors, and standards that are shared and expected of a particular culture. People from different cultures could behave differently depending on their manners and customs. As we know, people in the US usually use handshakes for greetings. Instead, people in Japan and South Korea normally bow to each other. Another example, in the States, people are totally fine to bring friends corinthus as a gift. However, in China, if you do the same thing, it would be considered extremely rude because Chinese people give corinthus only for people's funerals. Third, language. One obvious way in which countries differ is language. By language, we mean both the spoken and the unspoken means of communication. Language is one of the defining characteristics of a culture. The classic illustration of this phenomenon is that whereas the English language has but one word for snow, the language of the Inuit lacks a general term for it. Instead, because distinguishing different forms of snow is so important in the lives of the Inuit, they have 24 words that describe different types of snow, which include powder snow, falling snow, wet snow, drifting snow, and more. By the late 18th century, the British Empire had spread English through its colonies and geopolitical dominance, and since then, English has gradually emerged as the universal language of business, higher education, diplomacy, science, and international travel. Nowadays, over 70 countries' governments give special status to English. Besides spoken language, unspoken language or body language also plays an important role in personal communication. Facial expressions, gestures, posture, and tone of voice are all very powerful communication tools. Studies show that verbal language accounts for only 7% of the message people try to convey. The remaining 93% is nonverbal. 55% of communication is based on what people see, and the other 38% is transmitted through tone of voice. However, there are substantial cultural differences in how people use body language to communicate. For example, curling the index finger with the palm facing up is a common gesture that people in the United States and parts of Europe use to beckon someone to come closer. However, it is considered rude in China, East Asia, Malaysia, Singapore, the Philippines, and many other parts of the world. It's also considered extremely impolite to use this gesture with people. It is used only to beckon dogs in many Asian countries. Using it in the Philippines can even get you arrested. Fourth, religions. Religion is defined as a system of shared beliefs and rituals that are concerned with the realm of the sacred. A comprehensive demographic study of more than 230 countries conducted by the Pew Research Center estimates that there are 5.8 billion religiously affiliated adults and children around the globe, representing more than 80% of the world population. Among the thousands of religions in the world today, 4 dominate in terms of number of adherents: Christianity, with roughly 1.9 billion followers, Islam, with around 1.2 billion, Hinduism, with 750 million followers, and Buddhism, with 350 million followers. The geographic distribution of religious groups varies considerably. Several religious groups are heavily concentrated in the Asia-Pacific region, including the vast majority of Hindus and Buddhists. The Asia-Pacific region is also home to around 60% of the world's Muslims. About 20% of Muslims live in the Middle East and North Africa, and nearly 16% reside in sub-Saharan Africa. Of the major religious groups, Christians are the most evenly dispersed. Roughly equal numbers of Christians live in Europe, Latin America and the Caribbean, and sub-Saharan Africa. A plurality of Jews live in North America, while about 4 in 10 live in the Middle East and North Africa, almost all of them in Israel. Actually, Israel is the only country with a Jewish majority. Fifth, social stratification. All societies are stratified on a hierarchical basis into social strata to some extent. These strata are typically defined on the basis of characteristics such as family background, occupation, and income. Individuals born into a stratum toward the top of the social hierarchy tend to have better life chances than those born into a stratum toward the bottom of the hierarchy. They are likely to have better education, health, standard of living, and work opportunities. Although all societies are stratified to some degree, they differ in 2 related ways. First, they differ from each other with regard to the degree of mobility between social strata, and second, they differ with regard to the significance attached to social strata in business contexts. The term social mobility refers to the extent to which individuals can move out of the strata into which they are born. Social mobility varies significantly from society to society. The most rigid system of stratification is a caste system. A caste system is a closed system of stratification in which social position is determined by the family into which a person is born, and change in that position is usually not possible during an individual's lifetime. Although the number of societies with caste systems diminished rapidly during the 20th century, one partial example still remains. India has 4 main castes and several thousand subcastes. Even though the caste system was officially abolished in 1949, it is still a force in rural Indian society where occupation and marital opportunities are still partly related to caste. Alright, let's do a quick review of today's topic. In this video, we learned what culture is, what factors could affect the culture, and what elements are included in the culture. Culture is a set of values, beliefs, rules, and institutions held by a specific group of people. There are 3 geographical factors that could affect culture, which are landforms, climate, and natural resources. In addition, culture is a relatively abstract concept which involves a broad range of elements. Those elements include values, attitudes, manners, customs, languages, religions, social structures, and more. So, what element of culture is the most interesting to you? Did you have some interesting experience when you communicated with people with different cultural backgrounds? Please leave your thoughts in a comment below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.
All right, so this kind of gave a summation of some of the things that I've mentioned before, but this lecture has some additional information that is important.
Hello?
We talked about the components of culture, and these are some of the things that were mentioned. We talked about so customs, when habits or ways of behaving in specific circumstances are passed down through generations, they become customs. And we find that there are several customs that are, our family or grandparents passed down to us, like how to bake potato pudding or things like that. So that would be some sort of example. Don't have to necessarily look at cultural diffusion is important. So cultural diffusion is a powerful force of cultural change. So traditional cultures are especially vulnerable when introduced to lifestyles of people in wealthy industrialized nations. And we see this too in many instances in Jamaican culture, where we see there's an influence of the US culture specifically on Jamaican culture. I'm sure, I don't know how many of you have gone to Grand Gala, but you have seen Spider-Man at the Grand Gala, because those action figures or superheroes have become very much ingrained as a part of Jamaican culture. Cultural change. So this is where now the discussion talks about how culture evolves and some of the ways or some of the things that cause culture to evolve. So cultural trait, anything that represents a culture's way of life. And I said this before, we are talking about both material and non-material, or tangible and intangible things. So the material objects, the physical things that make up each culture, as well as the non-physical, such as the mores and values and norms and attitudes. Cultural diffusion, of the process where cultural traits spread from one culture to another, where you might find that because of globalization, for example, social media now, and I'm sure you're seeing now that many part of what has become in Jamaican culture now is content development, where we are now becoming influencers and social media influencers and content creators and comedians, and how we are able now to monetize that kind of that comedic side. For example, Dino, and there are many other persons who are using that as a way to make money. I think another thing too is that the male dancing in America has trickled into Jamaican culture, where now in Jamaican dancehall, you now have men who can whine better than, well, some people would say can whine better than women, are whining more than women. And also to within the Jamaican dancehall space, there are times, usually men didn't used to like necessarily dance, but there's a section or there's a segment in the dancehall where men are the ones dancing and women are the ones observing. So you have that kind of cultural diffusion, and it comes from the North American culture, where you have a lot of dance competitions, and most times male groups are the ones that win those competitions. So even something like a Magnum Kings and Queens, that is something that mimics North American culture. Rising Star mimics North American culture. All right, so when companies change cultures, so international companies are often agents of cultural change. This is very, very true. As trade and investment barriers fall, for example, US consumer goods and entertainment companies are moving into untapped markets. Critics sometimes charge that in exporting the products of such firms, the United States is practicing what is considered to be cultural imperialism, which means the replacement of one culture's traditions, folk heroes, and artifacts with substitutes from another country. And some people would even look at the dominance now of fast food restaurants or fast food outlets in Jamaica have really replaced the tradition of eating cooked food in Jamaica. Anybody do you think that would be a fair criticism of the fast food outlets in Jamaica, to say that they have affected? It's an example of cultural imperialism, where the tradition of Jamaicans cooking their food is no, not necessarily the case, because many Jamaicans now are just going to fast food restaurants, and there's an obsession, for example, with a KFC. Anybody wishes to comment?
A true circus right now, KFC make people stop cook all on Sunday.
Right. So many people are not
On
cooking
Friday.
food. People are not cooking food anymore. And to combat cultural imperialism, I know in France, for example, they have something where it's, for example, cultural expression, the radio stations have to play 50, I think it's 50 or 60% of French songs. And then the other 40 or 50% can be from outside. They're very strict on that. So do international businesses affect local culture? And we do see it, you know, from eating these things to eating these things, right? So from natural food and all of that, you know, to no fast food outlets. Cultural imperialism. And I wanted to kind of give you some additional information about cultural imperialism because I think it's also on the exam. It is on the exam, final exam. So it's important to note. And I'm going to pause in a sec so that persons can present, and then if anything, go back to the lecture. So fears of cultural imperialism still drive some French to oppose the products of Walt Disney Company and its Disneyland Paris theme park. They fear Mickey Mouse and Friends could replace traditional characters rooted in French cultures. McDonald's is also sometimes charged with cultural imperialism. It is reported that average Japanese child thinks McDonald's was invented in Japan and exported to the United States. Chinese children consider Uncle McDonald to be funny, gentle, kind, and understanding. Meanwhile, politicians in Russia decry the snickerization of their culture, a snide term that refers to the popularity of the Snickers candy bar made by Mars Incorporated. And I did talk about the BETization of some countries, the Disneyization of certain countries. There's a lecture that I gave you, and I use those particular terms, neologism as they're called, to speak about how, and those would be examples of cultural imperialism, where international businesses go in and they start affecting local culture. All right. And as I said before, many companies now they're pushing back against that. So sensitivity to cultures in which they operate can help companies avoid charges of cultural imperialism. Firms must focus not only on meeting people's product needs, but also on how their activities and product affect people's traditional ways and habits. Rather than view their influence and culture as the inevitable consequences of doing business, companies can take several steps. For example, policies and practices that are at odds with deeply held beliefs can be introduced gradually. Managers could also seek the advice of highly respected local individuals such as elders. So there's a way of how cultural imperialism can be addressed by an international company. All right, because if in some countries, and I think probably not today, but probably when we wrap up the lecture in the next class, in some countries, if the locals believe that it's affecting their local culture, they can stop supporting the international business, and it will fail. I think Walmart failed in Brazil, for example, because Walmart did not understand the culture of merchandising in Brazil. They made an assumption thinking that they could replicate the same business model I'm almost sure it is Brazil, and it failed. All right. But let the persons who are to present, you have to present before I go any further. Give me 1 second, let me get a paper and pen. Do I have? Yeah, give me a sec. All right, so we're going to go to the presenters. Let me just bring up the document. So let me just share screen quickly so that we are looking at the document, right? So this is the upgraded document. today we have Alri and Demari presenting, right? As well as Matthew and Rashid. So I know Alri is here and Demari is here. I don't see Rashid or Matthew was here earlier and he left. As I tell you, I'm not into any question more than if they fail the course, they're on their own. All right, so let's go with Alri. You're going to go first, okay? And then Demari will go after.
Okay, sir. Give me a minute. I'm gonna just pull up the document.
Okay, Alri. Demari, are you ready? You can go first if you want to know.
Yes, sir. You're still sharing screen. Hold
Oh,
on.
sorry.
Sir.
Hurry, and you have no more than 12 minutes, okay?
12 minutes to present, sir.
Yes.
Well,
No
yes,
more
sir.
than, you know, I said no more than. I hope you don't carry an entire book because remember it's two presentation.
Yes, sir.
So you have 29 slides. You don't want to get through all 29. What you can do is to speak to the presentation instead of reading the slides. All right, go ahead.
All right, so today I'll be looking at the descriptive international theories. So let's move on to the next slide. So the objectives for today is that we're going to look at what is international trade. You know, we're going to look at what is international trade theory, and as well as the international trade growth and the types of theories. So I hope that you enjoy and you might learn something from what I have to share with you guys. So first of all, you know, I would like to start out by, you know, stating what is the true meaning definition of international trade, which consists of all the economics and commercial transactions between two or more countries. You know, so these are trades that are carried across two international borders, you know, to satisfy humans or organization, you know, needs, you know, in terms of money, in terms of making money, in terms of food, you know, survival, and, you know, other transactions such as travel service or financial payments. So moving on. So what is trade theory? The trade theory is used to explain the existing pattern of trade. So the impact it has on domestic economy, as well as the type of public policies that should be introduced and increase a country's well-being. So moving on to what is international trade theories now. So as it stated here, so these are various theories that is used to analyze and explain the pattern of the international trades, right? So you can see now where trade theories connected to international trade. So basically these theories, they are used to explain the mechanism of international trade and how countries exchange their goods and service with each other. So international theories help countries in selecting what should be imported or sold, as well as how much within international trade should be conducted. So at first, international trade theories, where you have two types of international trade theories. So I'll be looking at both of them. So the first one is the classical theories, right? Which is based on the country. So by the middle east of the 20th century, the theory has changed from the country base to being firm or company base, right? So they are known as the modern trade theories. So which I will get into more as I go along. So now I'll be moving into the growth of the international theories. So with the growth of international theories, you know, it has shown the economists. So economists are the person who actually came up to develop theories to better understanding the mechanism of global trade. So within the history of how country traded goods with each other. So this is traditional historical concept are most prevail and are viewed from a standpoint of by the nation, right? So by the 20th century, theories standards stated in order to explain trade from a firm perspective rather than a country. So these theories can be classified as the modern firm or company-based theories. Okay, so with these theories, you know, you can actually improve the product or service, such as the brand and customer loyalty, technology, and the quality. So let's move on. So now we will be looking into the growth of international trade a little bit more. So this category, right? This category of contemporary, which is the firm-based trade theories, in contrast to the traditional country-based theories. It was originated after the World War II and was mostly produced by business school professors, not economists, right? So with the expansion of the global corporation, the firm-based theories changed to multinational corporations. So with the growth of the multinational corporation and intra-industry trade, which is the exchange of commodities produced in the same industry between two nations, where also is the country-based theories were unable to fulfill angles. So for instance, now, you know, Japan import Mercedes-Benz vehicles from Germany, and they sell Toyota vehicle to Germany. So now I'll be looking into the classic country-based theories, and I'll be giving like a quick synopsis of where it actually coming from to where it actually now. To where
You
it
have
is
8 minutes.
actually now.
You have 8 minutes remaining, and remember, you're answering a specific question. Okay, 8 minutes.
Okay. Okay, now so as it relates to the classical based trade theories, you have 4 types of theories. So it actually started out with the mercantilism, the absolute advantage, the comparative advantage, and the hectares of Olin. So moving on, we look at the mercantilism. So mercantilism was established in the 16th century and was one of the first to develop the economic theory. So, you know, he suggests the wealth of the country was determined of gold and silver. So the mercantilism theory believed that the country should not increase on the position of holding gold. The country should increase the position of holding gold and silver by promoting export and discouraging import. So, you know, they mean aim, they want the country to have trade surplus, and you know, they want to have a greater value of export than the value of import. So moving on. So mercantilism has started to strive in the 1500s and the 1600s, right? So like I don't have enough time. I'm gonna move on. Some of these. So the absolute advantage now. So this came about in the 1776 by the economist Adam Smith, where he take a probe into the mercantilism theory, where he stated that the wealth of the nations. So Adam Smith offered a new theory that was called the absolute advantage, which his main focus was on the ability of a country to boost efficiency than another nation. So he reasoned that trade between countries shouldn't be regulated or restricted by government policy or intervention. So he stated that trade should flow naturally according to market forces. So the next theory came about in the 1887 is the comparative advantage, which was published, which was by the economist David Ricardo. So he was an English economist who introduced the comparative advantage. So he argued about the challenge of absolute theory, that some country may be better at producing both goods than having an advantage in many areas. So he reasoned if a country A should have an absolute advantage in the production of both products, specialization and trade could still occur between two countries. So the last theory for the classic base is the Hector's-Ohlin, right? So he looked at the factor portion theory. So in the early 20s, two Swedish economists, the Eli Hector and the Bertil Ohlin, they focused their attention on how a country could gain a comparative advantage by producing products that utilize factors that were in abundance in the country. So they declared that the theory of Smith and Ricardo did help country to determine which product would give a country an advantage, and that both theory assumed that free and open market will lead countries and producers to determine which goods they could produce more efficiently. So for example, China and India are home to cheap, large pool of labor. So therefore, these countries have become the optimal location for labor-intensive industry like textiles and garments. So now, we'll take a look into the modern theory, which include the country similarity, the product life cycle, the global strategic rivalry.
You have 3 minutes.
The Porter's national comparative advantage. Okay, so the modern firm-based theory, it came about in 1961, right? So this theory suggests that consumer in country, they have the similar stage of development, would have similar preferences. So this theory create their products primarily for domestic consumptions. So when business consider exporting, they frequently discover that market would comparably clients' preference to their native market that have the greatest success. So moving on to the product life cycle. So this theory came about in 1960 by Raymond Vernon. So he developed the theory that speaks to the specialization of marketing, where he stated the three distinct stages of the product life cycle, right? So these include new products, maturing products, and standard products. He added that all the aspects of new products manufacturers will take place in a country where it was developed. So within that same period, this theory has brought success to the US manufacturing as well as went global in many industries. Okay. So the global
You have a minute.
Rivalry theory. So this came about in the 1980s. So the economists Paul Krugman and Kelvin Lancaster, so they developed this theory that, so their main focus was on the multinational corporation, and their effort was to obtain a competitive edge over the international sector, international in their business sector. So,
All right, that's time.
and
Thank you so very
finally,
much, Alri. That's time. I'm giving you enough time, and I have to keep it very time specific. Okay. So thank you very much, Alri. I'll do my comments after the other presenter. Go ahead. I think the other presenter is Damari Brown. Go ahead, Damari.
Okay, so good evening, everybody. All right, so because of difficulties in my laptop, Ari would do the share screen for me.
Okay.
Ari can respond. Okay, so today we'll be looking at prescriptive international trade. So before I explain what is prescriptive international trade, I must explain what is international trade. So I can move to the next slide. So international trade refers to the economic exchanges between countries. Consumer products, for example, furniture and natural resources and food are often exchanged. Other types of transactions involve services such as travels and payment for foreign assets. So the growth of international trade. So over the last 2 decades, the world trade has grown at a rate twice as fast as global output. However, trade has historically been a driver of growth. The international trading system has benefited from 8 rounds of multilateral trade liberalization, as well as unilateral and regional liberalizations since 1947, when the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, was established. Indeed, the final of these 8 rounds, or so-called the Uruguay rounds, which concluded in 1994, resulted in the formation of the World Trade Organization to assist administer the increasing corpus of multilateral trade agreements. The consequent global economic integration has boosted living standards all around the world. Most emerging nations have shared in this affluence, with the incomes rising outstandingly in certain cases. As a group, emerging nations have grown significantly in importance of the global trade, up to approximately a quarter in the 1970s. So moving into the progress in today, so progress has been impressive for a number of developing countries in Asia and to the lesser extent in the Latin America. These countries have become successful because they choose to participate in global trade, helping them to attract the bulk of the foreign direct investment in developing countries. This is true of China and India, since they embrace trade liberalization and other market-oriented reforms, and also of higher income countries in Asia like Korea and Singapore that were themselves poor up to 1970s, up into the 1970s. However, many other nations, notably Africa and in the Middle East, have made slower progress. The poorest nations have shared in global commerce has declined significantly, and without lowering their own trade barriers, they have risked greater marginalization. This classification applies to over 75 emerging and transition economies, including practically all of the least developed nations. In contrast to the successful integers, they rely on disproportionately unconventional commodity production and exports. The causes for their marginalization are diverse and include underlying structures issues, insufficient policy frameworks and institutions, and protection for both at home and abroad. So now we move into the prescriptive international trade theories. So prescriptive international
You have
trade
7
theories
minutes.
dictates how things should be. This theory also states how people or things should function rather than how they actually do. So in this paper or in this presentation, I will be looking at the 3 prescriptive theories and how it has impacted international trade. So one of the earliest efforts to characterize the role of international trade may be found within the very nationalistic body of thinking now of mercantilism. In respect to other nations, international trade involves numerous factors. There are several theories about international trade, and the 3 that I will be looking on is mercantilism, absolute advantage, and comparative advantage. So the first one is mercantilism.
Mercantilism, not chant. Mercantilism.
Mercantilism. Yeah, mercantilism. Sorry, mercantilism. So mercantilism is an economic philosophy that promotes self-sufficiency through a positive trade balance. Mercantilism policies prioritize wealth and resource accumulation while preserving a positive trade balance with other countries. Mercantilism is considered as a kind of economic protectionism since it maximizes exports while reducing imports. This theory originated with the establishment of nation states in the 16th century Europe. The predominant economic theory held that the global supply of wealth was finite and that it was in the best interest of the nations to accumulate as much as possible. At the time, wealth was measured by the country's silver and gold reserve. To amass greater riches, European countries such as the United Kingdom and France would prioritize exports over imports, resulting in positive trade balance. So mercantilism policies entail the control of domestic firms and the creation of trade surpluses. A positive trade balance is accomplished in the context of international trade by the government rules such as tariffs and imports restriction. Domestically, mercantilism policies promote domestic industries by creating monopolies and distributing capital to stimulate growth, such as policies are a type of economic protection aimed to encouraging self-sufficiency, and they are indirect contradiction to the free trade economics and
3 minutes
trade
remaining.
government.
You have 3 minutes remaining.
All right, so not to read everything here, but so the person or the philosopher that came up with this is Dr. Adam Smith and David Hu. So in present day mercantilism, although it is often regarded as an unknown economic philosophy measured have recently emerged, modern mercantilism or mercantilism generally refers to protections policies that limit imports in order to boost native industries. So the rest of it might be repetitive, so I just move on to the next theory, which is absolute theory. So the absolute theory is the capacity of an individual or nation to create more of an item or service per unit of a time with the same numbers of outputs, or to produce the same amount of goods or service per unit with less inputs than its rival. So the philosopher who or the economist who came up with this is Adam Smith. He created the notion of absolute theory in his book, The Wealth of Nations, to explain how countries might benefit from trade by specializing in manufacturing and exporting things that can manufacture more effectively than other countries.
2 minutes.
Okay, so an example of absolute advantage in the Middle East is that Middle East country can produce more oil quickly and cost effectively than other countries in North America, empowering them to absolute advantage. So basically, if you can produce more for yourself and a surplus, you might have an absolute advantage over other countries. Next slide, which is the comparative advantage. So the comparative advantage is what came up by David Ricardo, who's an economist. He introduced the notion of comparative advantage in the early 18s. He said that the country economic progress is boosted by most focusing on the industry, which it has the greatest comparative advantage. The capacity of our economy to produce a certain item or service at a lower opportunity cost than its trade counterpart is known as comparative advantage. So sir might explain it earlier in class. I remember he might say that the reason why most that call centers are a lot in Jamaica is because the labor cost is lower. So so that gives other countries the comparative advantage. I hope I'm explaining it right, but more persons would like to come here, do work here because the labor cost is lower and they get more for paying less, basically.
All right, thank you very much. Time. So the other two presenters will go on Friday. Let me just stop sharing screen for me, please. Thank you. And please email both presentations to me as well. Please email both presentations, okay? So that I can go through to see the parts that you were not able to discuss. The other two, the presenters on Friday are, let me just, because we did say, because we have to wrap up the presentations. Share our screen. On Friday, it is Matthew and Rashid. All right, so Matthew and Rashid are presenting on Friday. So let me go to the presentations. Let me start with the person who went last because it's easier to do it that way. So Damari, I think this was a presentation that was informed by, you had a lot of information. So let me start with the positive. So you had a lot of information. There was some amount of focus in the presentation. In other words, you tried to answer the question because the question says discuss how, in your case, discuss how descriptive international theories explain the growth of international trade. And there are different sections. You literally had a section that was looking at the growth of international trade. And there is also some evidence of critical analysis. I could hear at some points you were trying to add your own voice in it. I like the fact too that you had a controlling idea. There's a thesis, in other words. There's a kind of thesis in the presentation. So in other words, you said that you're looking at, you told me the specific, or told us the specific theories that you're looking at. You gave a definition of international trade. And you also, as I said before, kind of mentioned this, the growth and expansion of international trade. The concerns I have, however, no, include the fact that your thesis came much later in the presentation. Your thesis is supposed to come at the beginning of your presentation, not in the middle or much later in the presentation. I think you were at about the 5th slide before I understood exactly where you were going from. You looked at the growth of international trade before announcing your thesis. So I'm not sure if what was where did it fit in your presentation? Remember, the question says, discuss how this prescriptive, in your case, this prescriptive international trade theories explain the growth of international trade. You seem to have separated them. You looked at the growth of international trade, and then you looked at international trade theories, but that's not what the question asks you to do. It says discuss how prescriptive international trade explain the growth of international trade. So you kind of alluded to it to some extent, but it wasn't very clear. But I like the fact that you did define and tell us exactly what you understood prescriptive international trade to mean. That was very, very clear, and that was a very good thing in your presentation. So be very clear and understand the question. It says discuss how prescriptive international trade. So you need to, first of all, as you did in your presentation, give us your thesis at the beginning. And I'm giving you the points now for you to correct for the written work, for the actual essay that you're going to upload by Sunday. For that paper now, you need to be very clear in terms of the focus. So this paper will discuss 3 prescriptive international trade theories. The trade theories that you mentioned, these theories will be used to show how international trade expanded during the 20th century, during the 21st century. You need to choose a period. You can't be talking in just any period. Okay, it is very, very important that you're very clear. Also, I was a little bit concerned or unclear. Mercantilism is more a descriptive theory. So you gave us a history of mercantilism. Some of it was, to me, some of it was good, but some of it I'm not sure how relevant it was. So you gave a description of our historical review or overview of mercantilism. In that case, prescriptive mercantilism is a descriptive theory, not a prescriptive one. Because what you did, you spoke about what the theory talked about in the 16th century. We're not in the 16th century anymore. Fair, do you understand that? What I thought you were going to do now was to look briefly at the history of mercantilism, then now talk about neo-mercantilism in the contemporary context, for example, with Trump and the whole notion of trading, restricting trade and using trade tariffs. And as a result, because what he was really doing is reflecting the notion of what mercantilism is about. Keeping wealth, so wanting to export to other countries and limiting the imports from other countries. In other words, Trump's contention with trade balance. And it's not just Trump. If you look at modern examples of mercantilism, you can find those examples. The issue I have with both presentations is that you guys didn't go outside of my notes. You just stuck to anything I gave you. And it shows me that you're not doing additional work. You have to go outside of my notes, or else I'm going to mark it down severely. Remember, I caution you. The other part now is, so, and then you made an error. You said that Adam Smith was was one of the founders of mercantilism. But then you also mentioned that Adam Smith also wrote Absolute Advantage. But remember, Absolute Advantage came as a criticism of mercantilism. So it could not have been the same person who wrote both of them. So be very, very careful in terms when you're reviewing your information. As I said to you before, you cannot rely only on my notes. All right. And then sometimes you get mixed up in it. The other thing too, the Absolute Advantage, you gave the same example I gave in class. Why not give some different examples? I want for you to give me, this is how you're going to get your marks. This is how it's going to tell me that you're doing your own work. If you're only going to regurgitate the information that I gave you in class, I'm going to mark it down, because pretty much all you're doing is to giving me back the information that I gave you, but that's not learning. All right. Comparative advantage, it wasn't, so time ran out. But as I said before, in your paper, you just need 3 body paragraphs in your paper: introduction, 3 body paragraphs, and a conclusion. So one paragraph can look at how, for example, neo-mercantilism as an international trade theory explain the growth or the lack of growth of international trade if you want to if you want to talk about. And then you can say secondly, absolute advantage is another theory, or is another international trade theory that I'm going to use. That will be used to explain how explain the growth of international trade. And then you need specific examples. To some extent, you did have some examples which are good, but as I said before, try to go outside of the examples that I gave you. Yeah, so I felt that it was a relatively good presentation. I could hear your voice. I could hear that you were trying to answer the question. You had a focus, you had a thesis, but there are some other areas that you need to fix up. Okay. Any comments or questions for me before I comment on Damari, on Alray's presentation, Damari? So go ahead if you have any comments, questions before I move on, so that you can also take notes when you're correcting the document.
Okay. Just one question, sir. You were saying about the modern mercantilism.
Right. So
could you just-
remember, so originally, so mercantilism as a theory is descriptive, not prescriptive. But if you're looking at mercantilism as in the context of contemporary, in the 21st century, as a kind of neo-mercantilism, then it becomes prescriptive. But historical, because it's a historical theory, it's the first international trade theory, then it is descriptive because it was describing historically what happened in terms of international trade during the 16th century and during that period of time. Understand? So in that case, it is descriptive because it is describing what happened at a moment in time. One of the things that I thought you could have done too, and you kind of hinted at it, but it wasn't clear in the paper, you looked at international, I think you looked at liberalization, but liberalization, you could look at liberalization as a form of theory, as a theory that you're using to explain the growth of international trade, and then link that to the growth of the introduction of, for example, the World Trade Organization and different, not just the World Trade Organization, but other, the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, because all of them help countries to participate in international trade. So you could actually use liberalization or economic liberalization as a prescriptive trade theory to explain the expansion or the growth of international trade. Any other questions before I go on? And I have limited time.
No, sir. Thank you.
All right, good. So for Alray, let's start with the positives. So you had a lot of content and all of that, giving us a lot of historical overview, but I was a little bit disappointed with the presentation. Let me tell you why. You did not answer the question. You didn't even attempt to answer the question. What you really did was just to kind of read back the notes that I gave you in class. The question says, discuss how descriptive international trade theories explain the growth of international trade, right? So you need to tell me, so you mentioned, for example, I think you mentioned classical theories and firm-based theories. Is it that classical theories are descriptive international trade theories? Is it that firm-based theories are descriptive international? You kind of just went all over the place. You were just speaking about international trade theories in general, but there wasn't any focus in the paper. I had a serious difficulty with following in your paper because outside of the information that you were giving me that I already knew, you were not answering the question. The question says, discuss how descriptive international trade theories explain the growth of international. So one of the theories I thought you would have mentioned is mercantilism. And any trade theory can be prescriptive or descriptive. It just depends on what you're using it to explain. So mercantilism can be used to describe as a descriptive theory because it was describing history in a moment. You can use absolute advantage as a descriptive theory as well and describe about things that happened in terms of the growth of international trade during a period of time. So I didn't get a sense because you were just all over the place in terms of just regurgitating a lot of the information in class. I love the fact though that you gave a definition of international trade and you actually had international trade theories, but the expansion of was lacking. I didn't get the expansion of. So as a result, there wasn't as much critical analysis. Critical analysis is where I hear your voice, where you're using the sources, the information, and for the both of you guys, I didn't know where some of the information was coming from. If you plagiarize and upload the paper to Turnitin, I will fail you, all right? You make sure that you properly cite the information, and I'm going to ensure that I teach some of that during Friday's class as well. And when I wrap up the lecture on culture and business, and I think I probably touch on either foreign exchange or ethical issues in international business or something like that. And then I'll kind of go into how to cite sources. That's very critical. And then two, you never had any specific example. So even if you're talking about classical theories, where are the examples? For example, in Japan, international trade expanded into Japan, or Japan started expanding its international trade by setting up multinational corporations in these companies or so in these countries or something like that. I didn't get any examples at all. So you need to go back, look at the paper. If you want to kind of write, before you upload your paper, you send it to me and I kind of look at it. I will do that for you, both of you, before you upload. You must upload by Sunday, 11:59. Everybody who has presented before. If you do not, I'm going to give you 0. I will give you 0. You must upload your papers. All right, must upload it 11:59. And if you want me to look at the paper, you have to send it to me by Saturday, not on Sunday when it is due. Not on Sunday. You have to send it by Saturday. All right. Any questions, Alray, or comments? And please, guys, don't take it personal when you hear. I'm just speaking with passion. I'm just passionate. So don't think I'm trying to embarrass you or belittle or anything. I'm just a passionate person when I'm talking. All right. So don't ever think that my intentions are to hurt or embarrass you guys. That's not my intention. Okay. Let me just make that abundantly clear. Any question, comments, queries, Alray, based on my feedback? Alray, are you there? Oh, so he doesn't have any question, comments. I hope I don't make you feel bad, Alray. It's not intentional, all right? So don't feel bad.
Sir, he answered in the chat.
I know he answered me in the chat, but so Alray, you can reach out to me. Both of you can reach out to me if you have any additional questions. Okay. All right. So have a good night, everybody. If anybody has any questions or anything, any comments, queries, generally. No, so just remember the persons who are presenting on Friday. That is on Friday, I have Matthew and Rashid. I don't know so Rashid is here. I think Matthew was here earlier, but he left. So just remember that you have your presentation on Friday. Have a good night, everybody. Bye.
All right, sir.